Welcome to the second of these occasional organisational change reviews. I managed to get myself a bit more up to date. If you remember the last one, I was enjoying myself back in 1958. Today we're up to 2016 and thankfully the pandemic hasn't happened and all sorts of things haven't happened, but we're at least in the current decade. I'm going to share with you a short paper and just really plug it, which had a big impact upon me. It asked some quite awkward questions about organisational change and certainly made me think about a few things. So the title of the paper is Politics of Change, the Discourses that Inform Organisational Change and Their Capacity to Silence. It was published in Nursing Inquiry in 2016 and the author is McMillan. One of the things that I find really useful in organisational change is crossing over discipline boundaries and field study boundaries. So the best academics tend to be located within their own specialism, their own discipline, their own field of expertise, and they become better and better at that. But to cross over boundaries I think is exciting, and equally, and this is what we're doing here today, looking at somebody from a totally different field, how she sees organisational change, and I find that insightful for myself. She sees stuff that I would be blind to, in all honesty. I need to warn you, she isn't she doesn't mince her words, and she's not that positive about organisational change and the world of business, and I think that's fair enough. I do see in some academics' writing, it's almost like a love of business, a love of change, a love of management. Fair enough, that's up to them, but I sometimes wonder if we can really study and teach in an informed manner if we're besotted by what we're working with. That's probably a bit contentious, but what the heck. This is the Organisational Change Review Desk, and there's no senior manager who's going to haul me off the screen. Well, not for a few minutes yet. Okay, down to business. Very much coming from nursing studies and looking at organisational change and acknowledging organisational change sweeping through healthcare sectors. She suggests that organisational change has been the dominant discourse within health settings, which is interesting. Certainly from what I know as a layperson in the UK, it's been a huge phenomenon in the health sector and in education, I should add, for as far back as I can remember. But what we're getting here is equally, it's happening all over the world, which you could sort of guess at, but it's interesting that she's coming from a different context, but she's actually troubled by this dominant discourse of organisational change. So discourse is a theme we'll come back to probably in future videos, but it's very much about how it isn't just mere words, how language shapes our thinking. So the one you'll keep hearing me say about is we need change leaders. Where's the change leadership? Let's lead change. They're not just assertions, there's beliefs and attitudes, values, ways of thinking associated with that. And what she's getting at in this lovely little paper is it's quite difficult to speak out against that. And remember, she's coming from nursing. She's saying particularly for nursing staff, they feel like they've been silenced in their own workplace. They don't talk the language of organisational change. It doesn't excite them like it might do a business school academic. And yet the language of organisational change is shaping their working lives in profound ways. And she's offering a voice for nursing staff, and she's very specific. I think doctors, it's a different agenda, but nursing staff who merit a voice, and particularly because there's an element of vocation within health and in education. That voice should be heard, but she fears it isn't, and she offers a powerful question of that. Just looking at my notes I made when I was reviewing this paper, she goes over some of the literature on politics, and in a very knowing way. There's some critical literature on politics and organisational change, but it hasn't become like the mainstream way of thinking. I think I mentioned in the last video, for any practitioners out there, have you been to a workshop on how you can be more political in your workplace, or your head of politics in the workplace? It's just not on the agenda, and often in business schools it hasn't been on the agenda. There are studies. I cover some of the major ones in my textbook, so I'm not going to revisit those today. But what the point she's making, I would agree with. Organisational change has always been political in nature, but it has been predominantly theorised and researched in apolitical fashions. That's on page 225 of this paper. So yes, it is political, but we tend not to write and talk about the politics of it as much as we can. And that's a preface to the position she develops. Another of her concerns, which I almost said in the introduction to this video, page 226, she writes, the heavy reliance on business and management frameworks has yet to be extensively questioned in the healthcare sector, specifically the impact on the practice of nursing. Ouch. I get what she's saying there. Again, in some of my writing, I've talked about how Harvard Business Review professors' work has been taken into the education sector, the health sector, and the criminal justice sector. In the new textbooks, there are again references to all of those developments. And what I was trying to tentatively say is I'm troubled by that, because the Harvard Business School professors' work was never intended for those contexts. It was very much about business agendas. So can you really translate this work into the practice of nursing? I'm totally with her. I don't think those professors' work have a lot to say. In fairness to the professors, I don't think they were speaking to the health sector. If you look at Harvard, they've got other schools which cover those areas. It shouldn't be coming out of the business school, and yet it has. I have a concern, I don't want to get onto that soapbox today. She then takes us into Foucault, and in all honesty, the concept that she uses I wasn't familiar with. I've touched on Foucault. It has a lovely notion of the archaeology of knowledge in my own self-referential way. I'd like to think that the last piece where I was looking at one of the early books in organisational change, I like to think there's a bit of an archaeologist in me, but certainly probably not as Foucault meant his analogy of archaeology and knowledge and how we need to dig down to it. But she leads on a term, and I hope I'm saying it right, paraphasia, and it's the idea that certain forms of knowledge are silenced, and it becomes very dangerous to talk about those concerns, to not use the dominant discourse. So in a healthcare setting, if you're not talking about leaders, leadership, leading change, you're not on message. And sadly, you're not going to get promoted because you're not using that business management language that's been imported into the healthcare setting. That's what she's saying. And for me, that is deeply troubling. I really think we need to think about the context in terms of any attempt to manage or lead change, and I just wish there was more of it out there. And who knows, if anybody sees this video, hello, they can hear my screams. So she uses this concept, and the thesis of her paper is very much this idea that some good people's voices have been silenced in the name of change, and shouldn't we be shouting about it? I think what she's saying is, shouldn't academics be questioning it? Unfortunately, so much of the work in universities gets corrupted in how to change rather than the awkward questions that McMillan's raising. She finishes with a quote, and I'll try and put this up in parallel if I can press the right buttons. But if I read it for the time being, the will to explore alternative ideas such as paraphasia and disqualified knowledges is important in organisational research because it is important in organisational research, because it shifts the phenomenon of organisational change from one that is apolitical, measurable and predictable to the one that becomes moral, political and ethical, where there is a recognition of the impacts of organisational change on individuals. It's an awfully wordy quote, and would have helped if I could have read the first line a bit more clearly. But my work involves scholarship, so reviewing other people's writing. I don't do research, but I've spent too much of my life just looking at the writings of others. And this quotation hit me when I was preparing the new textbook, and I thought, wow. And the key words for me are organisational change being presented as apolitical, measurable and predictable. We rightly want the evidence, we want the research that informs change, but I've in recent years had a concern that that sort of corrupts change. It sounds a weird thing to say, but in a way, in trying to standardise it, to put it into the boxes, a lot of things aren't on the agenda. So if you look at evidence-based management, it quantifies the research that's been done, which is useful in its own right. But in areas such as the practice of nursing and the voices of nurses in change, if a lot of work hasn't been done, it gets silence for me. So be mindful about apolitical, measurable and predictable accounts of change. I'm increasingly seeing them, and they're helping advance agendas, but whether or not we pay a price in that we disenfranchise certain forms of knowledge, certain voices, I share her concern. And again, she urges us to think about organisational change as being more moral, political and ethical. And so much has gone wrong in the name of leading change and transformation over the last 2 decades. And I'm starting to see it happening in universities. They've bought into these Harvard models, and I'll probably do a video at some point in the future, and they're using them as though they're some sort of legitimate knowledge, but really there's not a lot underpinning them. It's heresy to say that, but so we need to try, and I hope these videos begin a process of provoking discussion, debate. Remember, what this Paraphasia is saying is it's dangerous, it's difficult even to raise these issues, so I get that, but I do think we need to do that. So all credit, lovely paper, not often mentioned. It's in a totally different field, so most change scholars wouldn't be looking in nursing inquiry, but I have ways of sifting through the literature, and every so often I pick up a little gem like this. So I don't know the author, I've never met her. I followed up to see if she'd done other work in this field excitedly, but she hasn't really, or credit to her. I think other things float about, but I did like this, and I hope this might encourage at least somebody else to have a look at it and think about what it means for their theorising, for their practice. So on that upbeat note, I will say bye-bye.